Well, being up here brings back several emotions, and standing on this stage, I had a few opportunities to be here as a student and talk, but there was one in particular that can still wake me up in the middle of the night with a cold sweat and almost like a PTSD kind of experience. And as a junior, I was in charge of the color guard for President Litvin's inauguration ceremony. And the way it worked was there were 4 of us cadets, and we were in our full dress uniform, and we had these shiny metal helmets that had been around since World War II. And when you looked or smelt the sweatbands that were inside those, you thought they'd been around much longer than that. So we were lined up on both of these aisles, and the way it was all the faculty and all their regalia was lined up for about half a mile, it seemed like, going out. The governor from the state of Illinois was here. I mean, it seemed like every VIP in the state came to that ceremony. And it was my job to get the flags from that end all the way down here in a silent, packed chapel. I mean, it was standing room only for that ceremony. So as cadets, we came up, we did our thing, trying to stay in step. You know, I'm calling the commands across this chapel. And we did our thing, and then all the faculty came down. They put us cadets way back, pretty much as far behind the curtains over there as they possibly could. But it still felt like we were pretty front and center. And so the ceremony started, and it went on and on and on, and the lights were so hot, and y'all know how August is here. And all I wanted to do was take a nap during that ceremony. But the thought of maybe nodding off and then having that big metal helmet go with a loud ka-chunk on this wooden floor and then roll off into the poor lap of some visiting dignitary was enough to keep me awake. So hopefully, front row, I won't trip over you, and hopefully you won't fall asleep. Okay. So there I was, a 30-something, recently moved to Colorado Springs, and the wife and I were going to a new church member orientation, and was making some introductions and realized that I had a connection with one of the gentlemen who had graduated from the Wheaton graduate school. And like any typical man, we initially get to, well, what do you do? So I asked him that, and he said something about he works in the ministry. He was going to be working in some kind of church. I forget exactly. He asked, well, what do you do? And I typically don't answer that question with a lot of detail. I don't want to embarrass people if they don't know the specific position or the terminology of the military, and I'll just gauge to see if they want to go deeper. So I just said, I'm in the Army. And his response floored me, and it's something that led to some of the soul searching that I'll describe with you today. When I said, I'm in the Army, he said, what a waste of a Wheaton education. What a waste. I've wrestled with my calling over the years. As a literature major, I tend to lean towards story. And this morning, I'd like to share with you a story of how I believe Christ called me to a particular vocation and some of the lessons I've learned, many the hard way. I'll tell you that I am doing the last thing I ever imagined myself doing when I was sitting in these chairs. And by the way, these are all my views and not those of the United States Army. So my story is one of a nomad. Like several of you, I grew up in the military. My father was a career Army officer. We moved every 2 to 3 years. I went to a different school every year except for the last 3 years of high school. I lived overseas in Germany, and I was blessed to grow up in a Christian home, and I came to Christ at an early age. Until I was 15, I thought my life's path needed to go through West Point. Well, because that's what my dad did. That's what his friends did. That's the thing to do, right? I had zero desire to be in the Army. Small technicality, if you want to go to West Point. But I liked West Point. That all changed for me after my freshman year of high school, when I volunteered to work for a month at a ministry retreat center in the high mountains of Colorado. It's called Spring Canyon. It's run by a ministry called Officers Christian Fellowship, and it caters towards military families to come in and rest and regroup in the Lord. It was there I received my calling. I was a long-haired, super shy, braces filled, real skinny back then kind of guy. and as high schoolers, you come and you volunteer for a month to work at this camp. And I was pretty frustrated at the time because there was this 15-year-old girl who was beautiful, super intelligent, godly, incredibly awesome. She happens to be sitting right over there as my wife. But back then, for me, it was nothing but weeping and gnashing of teeth, I'll tell you. So out of frustration amongst that and some other issues going on, I just had to get away from the rest of their group and wandered down to this area. And just to set the scene, this camp sits at 9,400 feet elevation. It's absolutely stunning. This narrow canyon, this valley, a sheer cliff that rises behind it. And on the other side is a 14,000-foot Mount Princeton, with one of its peaks called the Hook, looking right after it. And it was at night, full moon was out, and there's these series of ponds fed by the spring with some real lovely bridges that go over it. So I'm walking down there, just praying in the Lord and being fairly frustrated, and I heard a voice. I've never heard a voice like this before nor since, only time in my life. And it was so clear to me, I actually looked around. And that voice said, I want you to go to Wheaton, and I want you to be a pastor. I've never really heard much of Wheaton prior to that. A little bit in passing, but the more I looked into it, the more it quickly became a singular passion and desire for me was to come here to Wheaton College. I still looked at other college options, but this was the only place I applied. And in my mind, I was preparing to be a missionary, and Wheaton was the West Point of Christian schools. That's how I thought of it. My wife told me, don't say it's the Harvard of evangelical schools. But I wanted to go to the best. And the Lord confirmed that passion, which led to an opportunity for faith. My dad had just gotten out of the Army and he had just entered that highly cash-bringing in career field of being a seminary student. And he did it with 4 kids, including one of them, a special needs newborn. So the only way I was coming to Wheaton, as my dad told me, was if I got a 4-year Army ROTC scholarship. So I was forced to apply. I had zero desire to be an ROTC or to be in the Army, but I knew I needed to be at Wheaton. So I came, and my experience here at Wheaton initially was really tough. The initial impression was that every single student was beautiful, handsome, squared away, a whole lot smarter than I was, and they knew a heck of a lot more about God than I should have known at that point in my life. This led to being challenged in about every single area in my life, and out of that sense of brokenness, I really felt like I grew in the Lord as a student here. I quickly identified with ROTC and what we're about, trying to become the best leader we possibly can and influence people as part of a team looking to achieve a noble cause. But even when I graduated, I would have sworn, put the contract on, I'll sign it because I know for sure I'm only going to do 4 years active duty, my initial commitment, and then I'm going to go do real ministry somewhere else. And I'll tell you, you got to watch those kind of oaths. Also, when I graduated, as a guy who grew up hiking in the Germany Alps and the Colorado Rockies, I swore I would never come back to Illinois that just has the boring prairie path. So here I am, 18 years later, I'm still in the Army, and I'm back in Illinois. But what about that calling to be a pastor? Was I wasting my Wheaton education? Honestly, I really struggled with whether or not I was unfaithful to that calling to be a pastor for years, especially since it seemed so right to be where I was, serving in the Army. And it felt like God had his leading on our steps as a couple. And I liken this experience to Eric Liddell, who is in the movie Chariots of Fire. A show of hands. I know this movie's from the dark ages of the early 80s, but show of hands. Has anybody seen this movie? Okay. All right, hands down. Thank you. That's actually a lot more than I expected. I'm real pleased to see it. I first watched this movie as a 9-year-old, And for some reason, it just really took a hold of my life. I'm still amazed today that that movie with that message won the Academy Award for Best Picture. It's truly stunning. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to watch it. Guys, be warned, it's not an action-adventure movie. It's pretty deep, so you got to sit through maybe some slow-moving parts. But the character Eric Little in that movie so inspired me, I actually named my firstborn son after him. And just what Eric Little had to live with and what he lived for. This movie's based on a true story. Eric Little was one of the best Scottish rugby players in his day. And he had a decision to go serve on the mission field in China, where he had grown up, or compete as a sprinter in the 1924 Paris Olympics. And there's a key scene in the movie regarding vocation that's always stood with me. And in this scene, Eric is walking with his sister Jenny, and it's in the hills above the city of Edinburgh, Scotland. Beautiful heather, great weather, one of the rare days in Scotland. You can hear the industry down below in the city, the train whistles, the ships coming into the strait. And his sister had really been pushing Eric to go to the mission field. She was pretty clear that that's what God's call on Eric's life was in her interpretation. So there's this source of conflict throughout the first half of the movie. And while they're hiking, Eric stops her. He grabs both her hands, he looks her in the eye, and he says, Jenny, you've got to understand, I believe God called me for a purpose, and that's China. But he also made me fast. And when I run, I feel his pleasure. When I run, I feel his pleasure. Well, God gave Eric Little a cause, a burden, and the Lord is still glorified through Little's life today. I realized early on in my life that God placed a burden on my heart for people. And I say that because that's the only way I could have described it when I was a student or as a young officer. I gravitate towards taking care of people and trying to make their lives better versus more technical vocations. God also gave me a passion for teams, working within the construct of a team, as well as a passion for those in the military. My lovely wife Amy and I looked hard many times at getting out of the Army in the last 18 years. It never felt 100% sure that we needed to stay in as long as we have, even to the point where we would shadow people in other professions for a day, just to see. And every time it was confirmed that the Lord had us where he wanted us. But I felt like God was pleased with the course we had taken within our vocation. But in my mind, I did still wonder if I was truly fulfilling my calling to be a pastor. And I discussed this with a mentor of mine that I asked to disciple me the one year that we had together when I was assigned in Kansas. As we discussed vocation and the definition of pastor, came to understand that really my view of it was too narrow. You know, I thought pastor and, hey, you're in charge of a church and you're giving sermons. And I knew I didn't want to do that. That was not the passion I had. But one of the other definitions of pastor is being a shepherd and looking after people. And the Army would never say that's one of the duty descriptions of a commissioned officer, but in essence, that's what it is. Every ROTC graduate from here is commissioned by the President to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to get the job done, but also to take care of our soldiers while we do it. As we like to say in the Army, mission first, soldiers always. And as I think back over the last 18 years of service, I don't think first about the countless operations, the countless training exercises that I've been on, or the really cool places I've had a chance to see. What comes to mind are the experiences I've had with people as I've been following my passion of pastoring and shepherding. For example, every 6 months in my specialty in the Army, we have to shoot our tanks, our Bradleys. It takes a while to get a crew of 4, of which the officer is one, functioning as one unit into what that tank needs to be doing. So we put up a whole lot of plywood targets. Some of them can move on these train tracks, and we go out and we practice shooting. Well, when I was down in Texas before coming up here, I was on what's called a Bradley fighting vehicle. It would look like a tank to pretty much everybody. And when you shoot these rounds, especially down in Texas, where it can be pretty hot and dry, sometimes some of those rounds, as they skewer off, they might start a small brush fire with some of the environment. So sure enough, I'm shooting at 2 in the morning, and it's a crew of 2 others. I've got a driver who was 22 years old, and then my gunner who was 23. Small little turret, we're all kind of cramped in there doing our thing. We started a little fire, so we had to stop while the other soldiers went to put out the fire. Beautiful night, September in Texas, the stars at night, and yes, it was deep in the heart. And while we were waiting for that fire to be put out, just hanging out on top of that Bradley, talking to that 23-year-old who had been married for 2 years already, was just having a kid. His wife was due in a few months. And I think we talked for 3 hours just about life. How do I be a good dad, sir? How do you raise a kid? I have no idea. During that conversation, on top of that Bradley, I felt his pleasure. Or when I was in Iraq and I was inspecting some of the soldiers, we had 160 soldiers that literally lived right on the border of Iraq and Iran. Their job was to help train the border guards for Iraq. Looking at the Iranians every single day, and these young captains, younger than 30, would give them some advice, and then just talking about what's going on in their lives and trying to resource them, make them successful as a team. I felt his pleasure. Or when I do long foot marches, with heavy backpacks, army backpacks, and we've got our gear and our helmets, and we're going miles up and down hills. Gives you lots of time to bounce around to all your soldiers or cadets and talk to them, what's going on in their lives. I feel his pleasure in moments like that. So you know a little bit about where I'm coming from with my story. Let me shift gears and offer a few lessons learned. And this is what I wish Colin, the Wheaton student, sitting week after week in these comfortable blue chairs, what I wish I would have held on to with an ironclad grip as I entered the workforce. And I share this as one alum to a bunch of future alums. And the first, the spiritual disciplines matter. The spiritual disciplines matter. Just as I at times have failed my wife and my family by not seeking them, or maybe choosing nice to do work over need to do work and being with my family, I have found the same with Christ. In some ways, I stopped desiring the Lord over the years, in large part because I stopped going to the foot of the cross and presenting myself to his guidance, his love, and his direction. And because of that, my moral compass started to fail in some areas. The disciplines I have found, they're not a fail-safe, nor are they a ritualistic pursuit of process. But it is all about submitting ourselves to our Lord. Guard against the slow fade that Casting Crowns sing about in their songs. And you do that by applying the disciplines. Second lesson I learned. Idolatry rises incrementally in the midst of routines. It rises incrementally in the midst of routines. Life in a profession, even one like mine, where it's pretty adventurous. And we've got a high frequency of change. In the Army, we change jobs on average every 12 months. And we change locations every 2 to 3 years. And there's always some crisis that we get to prepare for. I would typify college as more of a sprint. My experience for the last 18 years in the workforce was more of a marathon, where almost every mile seems the same. It's just one more season, slightly different terrain, but it really feels like a marathon, except it actually gets faster at the end. Time really speeds up, even though you're in a marathon. As an example, in my own line of work, when we're deployed, it usually feels like we're doing 2 years of work in the space of 1 year. There's no weekends, the enemy's not taking a break, and the days can be very long, sometimes the nights too. Intermixed with a lot of great moments, serving with some great people, but even in an uncertain and complex environment like combat, there are routines that are very similar to life back here. These rhythms and the tyranny of the latest urgent task can lull us into not running the race God calls us to do. I was struck by this even this week in my readings. Two verses you're very familiar with, and they were kind of my fail-safe verses when I came to Wheaton. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. That made a lot of sense to me when I was a student. And I hardly ever looked at the other two verses that came after. This week, those other two verses just hit me right between the eyes, based on my scar tissue from the last 18 years. So Proverbs 3, 7 and 8. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. You know, when I was in Iraq, every time we went on a mission, we would build in time to inspect each other. As a patrol, we'd be gathered together. Usually it was pretty hot, no matter the time of year, and we'd check to make sure that all of our body armor, usually about 30, 40 pounds of body armor, was on, it looked good, weapons were straight, everybody had their ammunition, and as a leader, we'd look every person in the eye and make sure that they were dialed in to the plan and this mission. Are you with me? How come I didn't put on my spiritual armor? Why did I not take the same approach in a campaign that had vastly deeper impacts than that patrol in Iraq? So I encourage you, do the hard work of confronting your sin, and as the Lord tells us, to heal your flesh and bring refreshment to your bones. All right, you're hearing it from someone who hasn't done it perfectly since he came out of Wheaton. Third thing I learned, I can't do this on my own. I can't do it on my own. I always knew up here that we need fellowship and we need help. That's how the Lord wired it. But really in practice, over time, that's not what I did. But I learned that you got to be in fellowship with flesh on it. And that this won't be handed to you on a platter when you leave here. You know, I liken fellowship here, it's kind of like going to Saga. You know, you've got this vast array of the best food in the country, and which flavor of the best food do I want to eat today? Same thing. There are so many opportunities to fellowship in the Lord here at Wheaton, and that's awesome. None of that will be handed to you like Saga does when you leave here. And I found usually it was about the 3 or 4 year mark for me and my peers where that really became a challenge. As maybe some change comes, there's more pressures in life, are you really going to make the effort to seek it out? Because no one's going to be knocking at the door. Hey, here's our Bible study on our dorm room floor at this time. Why don't you come? Okay. So I tell you that saying you got to make an effort. I encourage you, commit to seeking fellowship no matter where the Lord leads you. Last lesson I'd like to leave with you. Work can be worship. That's how it's meant to be. Not a separate part of life that we have to get through. It's not a curse that we have to get through, but it is one of the main ways that we worship the master worker. As a student here, I never really thought through how I should worship the Lord in that area. I really viewed it as distinct areas, even though I knew I'd be spending 80% of my life in the workforce. So I encourage you to spend some time thinking about this and how are you worshiping not only now in your preparations, but how we glorify God by your approach to work. In conclusion, God has a calling for each of us. I like how John Piper calls us to have a wartime mindset due to the spiritual warfare that rages every day. And he says in his book, don't waste your life. The war is not primarily spatial or physical, though its successes and failures have physical effects. Therefore, the secular vocations of Christians are a war zone. There are spiritual adversaries to be defeated, that is, evil spirits and sins, not people. And there is beautiful moral high ground to be gained for the glory of God. You don't waste your life by where you work, but how and why. You don't waste your life by where you work, but how and why. As we like to say farewell in the Army, I'll see you on the high ground.